My name is Clara Novak, and until recently, I was the operations manager at Northwest Timber Products in Spokane, Washington. I dedicated 12 years of my life to that company. 12 years of early mornings, late nights, and countless hours spent refining systems, streamlining workflows, and building something that actually worked. When I first joined, Northwest was a mess. Outdated processes, high waste, frequent delivery errors, and client complaints piling up faster than the logs in our mill yard. I came on board right out of my MBA program, eager to prove myself and make a real impact. I started as a process analyst, diving into the data and spotting inefficiencies that had been overlooked for years. Slowly but steadily, I worked my way up the ranks. Under the leadership of our former CEO, Harold Bergman, I was given the trust and authority to overhaul our entire production model. Together, we transformed Northwest from a struggling regional player into one of the most respected timber companies in the Pacific Northwest. We implemented sustainable forestry practices, invested in modern equipment, and built strong, long-term relationships with key clients across Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. Our client retention rate hit 94%, and our efficiency metrics reached an all-time high. I wasn't just doing a job, I was building a legacy. Then Trevor RHS arrived. The board brought him in after Harold retired, hoping his flashy background in corporate strategy and disruptive innovation would take us to the next level. At first, I gave him the benefit of the doubt. He asked insightful questions, scheduled meetings with every department head, and even complimented my work. But soon, the red flags appeared. He brought in consultants who knew nothing about the timber industry, but loved to talk about culture alignment and brand synergy. He renovated the executive floor, complete with Italian leather chairs and an espresso bar, while ignoring my repeated requests for critical equipment upgrades. Team-building retreats replaced production deadlines. Buzzwords replaced strategy. Still, I adapted. I translated his vague directives into actionable plans. I buffered my team from the chaos and kept operations running smoothly. I believed, naively, that results would protect me, that if I kept the numbers strong and the clients happy, my job would be safe. I was wrong. One Friday morning, I was called into Trevor's office and informed that I was being replaced, effective immediately. My replacement? Greg Wilson, a man with zero manufacturing experience, no background in operations, and whose most recent job had been managing his family's car wash. I was told Greg shared Trevor's vision and would help modernize the company. It wasn't just a slap in the face, it was a dismantling of everything I had built. And the worst part? Trevor had already introduced Greg to the staff before even telling me I was out. My severance papers were waiting in my inbox before I left his office. 12 years of service, reduced to a 2-week transition period and a carefully worded email saying I was pursuing new opportunities. But what Trevor didn't know was that I wasn't going down quietly. I should have known something was off the moment Greg Wilson walked into my office. He had that easy charm, sun-kissed skin, too white smile, a golf polo under a blazer he clearly threw on last minute, and none of the poise or presence of someone stepping into a high-stakes operational role. He shook my hand like he was meeting the concierge at a resort. "Clara, great to finally meet you. Trevor's told me so much," he said, as if we were two old colleagues grabbing coffee, not a seasoned executive being replaced by a total outsider. Behind him, through the glass walls of the executive lounge, I could see Trevor watching us with a champagne flute in hand. He raised it slightly in my direction, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. I forced a polite smile and showed Greg around the office like a professional, even as my stomach churned. The man didn't know the difference between pine and cedar. He misnamed our largest client and couldn't read a production chart if his life depended on it. This wasn't a promotion, it was sabotage. As we walked the production floor, I kept my voice steady while explaining systems I'd spent years developing: real-time material tracking, vendor-integrated procurement, predictive scheduling algorithms. Greg scribbled in a leather-bound notebook without asking a single follow-up question. I asked where he'd worked before. He shrugged. My family runs a car wash business. I managed that for a while. Totally different industry, but business is business, right? I nearly laughed. I wanted to scream. Instead, I nodded. Later that afternoon, I overheard Greg and Trevor laughing behind the executive lounge's cracked door. She's still explaining systems like I'm actually going to use them, Greg chuckled. Wait till she finds out we're outsourcing half the ops to that consulting firm. Trevor's voice was low, but I caught every word. Board doesn't know that part yet. Let's get Claire out the door first. Then we frame it as a cost-saving initiative. I stood frozen outside the door. They were planning to gut my department, my team, and feed it to some outside firm with zero context or industry knowledge. Worse, they were hiding it from the board, manipulating the narrative to make it look like smart budgeting when it was really about control. Greg wasn't hired to manage operations. He was hired to be Trevor's puppet. That night, back in my office, I sat staring at the operations manual I'd been updating for Greg. I couldn't believe I had spent the afternoon training the person who was going to dismantle everything I built. 12 years of loyalty, efficiency, and results, reduced to a 2-week formality, a smokescreen for a hostile takeover of the company's core. I felt rage, yes, but also something more urgent, responsibility. My team had trusted me. Clients had relied on the systems I'd implemented. If this outsourcing plan went through, it wouldn't just cost jobs. It would threaten delivery schedules, compliance metrics, even our sustainability certifications. Trevor wasn't just pushing me out, he was jeopardizing the very foundation of Northwest Timber. The next day, I received an email from HR, reminder to sign my severance agreement. Attached was a confidentiality clause so tight it practically wrapped around my throat, no mention of the outsourcing plan. No reference to the fact that Greg had already started making executive decisions before even learning the difference between hardwood and softwood. I didn't sign it. Instead, I began quietly documenting everything. I reviewed board mandates, dug into past approvals, and started connecting dots. During a break room chat, I learned from accounting that Trevor's brother-in-law had just been hired as the purchasing director for Wilson Construction, one of our top clients. Trevor had taken him golfing last weekend. Coincidence? Please. By lunch, I'd uncovered whispers of preferential contract terms being drafted, 15% below market rate with guaranteed inventory during shortages. We'd never given those kinds of deals to anyone, ever. Trevor wasn't just playing politics. He was weaponizing the company for personal gain. And if no one stopped him, Northwest Timber would fall, not from poor performance, but from the inside out. The deeper I looked, the more disturbing the picture became. What Trevor and Greg were doing wasn't just an internal power shuffle. It was a calculated dismantling of our operations with potentially catastrophic consequences. And all of it, every shady deal and deceitful maneuver, was being hidden under the guise of modernization. By midweek, I'd begun piecing together a broader pattern. The Wilson Construction deal was just the tip of the iceberg. There were whispers of similar contracts being drafted for 2 other companies, both of which had personal connections to Trevor. One was run by a former colleague from his previous firm, the other by a friend who once hosted Trevor's wedding. All 3 contracts featured suspiciously generous terms, below market pricing, extended payment periods, and, most alarmingly, preferred supply guarantees. That last clause was particularly dangerous. In the timber industry, raw material allocation during shortages is governed by strict internal protocols. We prioritized long-standing clients based on volume, reliability, and payment history. Offering a preferential deal to an outside company for personal gain wasn't just unethical. It could lead to lawsuits if it affected our ability to meet other client obligations. Worse still, I couldn't trace any of these deals back to board approvals. Trevor had promised transparency when he was hired. He'd vowed to preserve our sustainable practices and involve the board in any structural changes. But according to the archived minutes I reviewed, nothing about outsourcing, contract restructuring, or executive realignment had ever been presented for a vote. The moment I realized this, something clicked. This wasn't incompetence. This was a cover-up. And I was in the way. I started documenting everything quietly, methodically. Every conversation, every odd directive, every moment that Greg slipped and revealed something he shouldn't have. I used my remaining access to save copies of reports and operational data that I suspected would be altered once I was gone. But by Thursday, even that lifeline started closing. I arrived at work to find my email credentials disabled. It told me, sheepishly, that it was per Trevor's direct request, in anticipation of your early departure. And I wasn't even allowed to send a goodbye email. It was a clear message. They didn't want me seeing anything I wasn't supposed to during the remainder of my so-called transition. Fortunately, I wasn't completely shut out. Thomas, my assistant of 7 years, still had full access. When I explained the situation, he didn't hesitate. You always told me to keep backups of everything. I did. He handed me a flash drive. Consultant contracts, drafted pricing sheets, client allocation memos. It's all there. I stared at him, floored. You kept all this? You trained me to be thorough, he said with a shrug. On that drive, I found exactly what I feared, and more. The consultant proposal for outsourcing operations was a disaster waiting to happen. The firm they were hiring had zero experience in timber logistics. The cost savings Trevor kept touting, only possible because the proposal excluded onboarding costs, systems training, and transition delays. Even worse, there were red flags around compliance. The proposal made no mention of how the new firm would maintain our environmental certifications, carbon offset tracking, or replanting metrics, all of which were foundational to our brand. If implemented, the plan wouldn't just gut our operations. It would violate several sustainability agreements we'd signed with both federal agencies and private watchdog groups. Fines, revoked certifications, PR nightmares. It was all on the table, and Trevor wanted to bulldoze through it before anyone noticed. There was no doubt now. Trevor was misleading the board, deliberately, systematically, and with the help of someone who didn't even understand the stakes. Greg didn't need to know the business. He was just there to smile, nod, and give Trevor cover while the real decisions happened behind closed doors. But Trevor underestimated one thing: I wasn't leaving quietly. I called Elaine Robinson that night, one of the few board members I trusted, a longtime ally of our former CEO, Harold. I laid out everything: the contracts, the consultant proposal, the access restrictions, and the clear breach of governance. Her response was immediate. You need proof, she said. Documentation, anything signed, emails, memos, directives. The board won't move on suspicion alone. I have it, I said. Then I want you at the next board meeting, Elaine replied. I'll get you in as a guest speaker on operational continuity, but be warned, Trevor will try to block you, and once he senses you're onto him, things will escalate fast. She wasn't wrong. The next morning, I walked into my office to find Greg already inside, rifling through my files. Just getting familiar, he said with a fake grin, since your last day might be sooner than expected. The trap was closing, but I had everything I needed to blow it wide open. I knew I had one shot to get this right. If I moved too fast, Trevor would bury everything before the board could see it. If I moved too slow, I'd be escorted out of the building and silenced under a non-disparagement clause. So I played along. That morning, Trevor summoned me into his office, smug and controlled, like a man who believed the game was already won. Clara, he said, lacing his fingers together, we've decided to end your transition early, effective immediately. I nodded slowly, pretending to be caught off guard. Is there a reason? He tilted his head. It's clear you're struggling to embrace the new direction. We believe it's best to close this chapter cleanly, for everyone's sake. I glanced at the revised severance agreement he slid across the desk. This time it included an even tighter non-disparagement clause and a veiled threat: sign today or lose everything. I understand, I said quietly. I'll review it and return it by the end of the day. That was the lie he needed to hear. Back at my office, I packed my personal items in a box with slow, deliberate motions. I kept my face neutral, allowing Greg and Trevor to believe they'd won. Greg even strutted by with a coffee in hand and a smirk that screamed overconfidence. Tough day, huh? He said. Tough year, I replied, my voice calm. By noon, I'd slipped Elaine a message through her personal email. "We're moving. I'll be ready for the board meeting. I have everything." She responded with a single line, "I've arranged your access." At 2:15 p.m., just as I was preparing to walk out with my dignity and my box, I heard Greg on the phone in the conference room speaking louder than he realized. "Yeah, we've cleared her out. She suspects nothing. The outsourcing launch is on track. The board will get the new strategy after implementation starts. Trevor's confident they'll have no choice but to go along." It took everything in me not to walk in and slam the door behind him, but I didn't. Instead, I let the door stay open. Let him think I was gone. Let him think I was defeated. Later that evening, I met with Elaine at a quiet cafe 2 miles from the office. She laid out the next step. The board's executive committee had agreed to hear me. Informally, off the record, no promises but a chance. But I'd been listed as a transition consultant, which would grant me access for the next few days, even without an official title. "I just need the facts," she said, looking me in the eye. "Nothing emotional, just numbers, policies, and proof." "You'll have it," I replied. The next morning, I returned to the office in a simple gray blazer and flats. No power dressing, no confrontation. I looked like someone who had accepted her fate, but I wasn't defeated. While Greg fumbled through sustainability compliance meetings, completely unprepared for the replanting data questions, I was quietly gathering the last pieces of evidence I needed. Thomas had already backed up the final pricing spreadsheets and consulting agreements. I organized the documentation by date, flagged every governance violation, and prepared a presentation so clear, so airtight, it would be impossible to ignore. Trevor believed I was gone. Greg believed I was irrelevant. That was their first mistake. The day of the board's executive committee meeting began like any other. Trevor strutted through the office with the smug confidence of someone who thought he'd already won. Greg lingered behind him like a shadow, still out of his depth, but convinced he had a front-row seat to power. I walked into the building as quietly as I could, escorted by James Werner, the board chair himself, who met me at the security desk. "Elaine told me what's going on," he said in a low voice. "We'll give you the floor. Just stick to the facts." "I will," I said, clutching the folder of documents I had spent the last week assembling. Upstairs, the executive boardroom felt colder than usual. Mahogany table, polished glass walls, 10 chairs, only half of them occupied. Trevor was already seated, Greg beside him, both visibly unsettled by my presence. Elaine sat across from them, flanked by 2 other committee members. "Clara," Trevor said, feigning surprise. "I don't believe you were invited to this meeting." "She's here at my request," James replied firmly. "Given the recent concerns raised about operational changes, I believe her insight is not only relevant, but necessary." Trevor's face tightened. Greg's eyes darted to the door like he wanted to leave. "Let's begin," James said. I stood, opened my folder, and began. "Over the past 12 years, I've overseen every operational system within Northwest Timber Products," I said. "What I'm about to present are structural changes that not only contradict the company's sustainability commitments, but also violate board governance protocols and expose us to serious financial and legal risks." I laid out the consultant contract first, showing how the outsourcing proposal, already partially implemented, had bypassed board approval. I pointed to the glaring issues: lack of compliance tracking, no defined onboarding process, hidden transition costs disguised as savings. One chart compared current operational costs with projected costs from the proposal, after factoring in penalties, inefficiencies, and risk exposure. The result? A net increase of nearly 18%, despite Trevor's promise of cost reductions. Trevor shifted in his seat. I moved on. Next were the client contracts, Wilson Construction, plus 2 others. Each one showed below-market pricing, extended terms, and exclusive supply guarantees during shortages, something we had never offered, not even to our most loyal clients. The final pages revealed that all 3 companies were directly tied to Trevor's personal network. I paused, then added, "These preferential deals compromise our relationships with existing clients, violate our standard allocation policies, and risk breaching our own ethical supply agreements." Silence. Then I dropped the final piece, Trevor's own email directive to Greg, instructing him to move forward with outsourcing prior to board presentation. So by the time they see it, it's already too late to object. I slid printed copies across the table. No spin, no embellishment, just facts. James scanned the document slowly, his expression turning grim. Elaine stared directly at Trevor, her jaw tight. "Trevor," James said, "is this accurate?" Trevor leaned forward, his tone defensive. "This is a gross mischaracterization. Clara is clearly bitter about her departure and is twisting details to paint me in a negative light." "The documents speak for themselves," I interrupted calmly. "Every number, every contract, every directive has a timestamp and a digital signature. This isn't bitterness, it's governance." Greg looked like he wanted to melt into the floor. Elaine finally spoke. "Trevor, you've made sweeping changes to core operations without board approval. You've exposed the company to compliance risk, and you've awarded contracts that directly benefit people in your personal circle. That's not modernization, that's misconduct." "I was going to present everything at the next full meeting," Trevor insisted. "No," James said flatly. "You were going to bury us in paperwork and assume we'd rubber stamp it after the damage was done." He turned to me. "Clara, thank you. Please wait outside while we deliberate." I left the boardroom without a word, my heart pounding, not from nerves, but from the adrenaline of finally speaking truth to power. I had done everything I could. Now it was up to them. 30 minutes later, James emerged. "Trevor's been terminated, effective immediately. Greg will not be assuming any leadership role, and the outsourcing plan is rescinded in full." I nodded, swallowing the surge of emotion. "We'll also be auditing all executive decisions made since Trevor's hiring," James added. "You've saved this company from what could have been an irreversible disaster." The fallout was swift and brutal. By the end of that same day, Trevor was escorted out of the building by corporate security. No farewell party, no final words, just a tense walk down the executive hallway as staff members looked on in stunned silence. I didn't watch it happen, but Thomas later told me that Trevor didn't even pack up his office himself. He left behind his designer nameplate, his espresso machine, and the illusion of control. Greg didn't last much longer. Once the board realized he had no operational knowledge and that he had knowingly participated in the cover-up, they quietly removed him from the building. He never even got to finish his coffee. The last I heard, he was back in California trying to consult for small businesses and explaining away his sudden exit from Northwest as a strategic disagreement. Word spreads fast in our industry. No one was buying it. The board acted decisively. All preferential contracts were suspended pending legal review. The consultant agreement was torn up before implementation could begin. Elaine personally led the effort to restore transparency and order to the operational review process. And while James was initially hesitant to launch a full audit, he changed his mind when more questionable expenses under Trevor's name surfaced, including lavish client dinners that never actually involved clients. Internally, the company was shaken, but grateful. My former team reached out with messages of support, relief, and quiet celebration. The systems I had built, the ones Trevor wanted to erase, remained intact. In fact, they were now held up as the model for how Northwest should continue. Sustainable, efficient, and built on expertise, not ego. A few days later, James and Elaine called me back to the office. This time, I sat at the head of the boardroom table. "We'd like you to return," James said. "Full authority over operations, a compensation adjustment, whatever you need." It was a moment I'd dreamed of, in some version, during the worst days of the transition. But now that it was real, I felt something shift inside me. "I'm honored," I said, "but I think it's time for me to move on." They looked surprised. "I've had 2 offers in the past week," I explained, "and I think I need a fresh start. But I'm willing to stay through a structured transition, help you stabilize, onboard the right person, and ensure the company doesn't lose momentum." Elaine nodded with respect. "We'll make that arrangement." Over the next 3 months, I stayed on as a strategic consultant, rebuilding trust within the team, closing the gaps left behind, and advising the board on long-term safeguards. When I finally did leave, it was on my terms, with my reputation not only intact, but stronger than ever. And Trevor? He threatened legal action, claimed I had leaked confidential materials, and sent one last venomous email to the board. James responded with a single line: "Any legal inquiry will trigger a full audit of all decisions made during your tenure." We never heard from him again. Sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's delivered in quiet meetings, silent nods, and the sound of a closing door behind someone who thought they'd never lose. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do when someone tries to erase you is to prove that you were never replaceable in the first place. About 2 weeks after my formal exit from Northwest Timber, just as I was settling into a quieter rhythm and preparing for the next chapter, I received a call from a journalist. She introduced herself as a senior writer for an industry publication that covered corporate governance and sustainability in manufacturing. "We've received a packet of internal documents," she said. "They detail some concerning contract arrangements and strategic shifts at Northwest Timber under Trevor RHS. Your name came up as someone who may have insight." I kept my voice even. "I'm no longer with the company." "I understand," she replied. "Off the record, thank you for your time." I hadn't leaked anything, but someone clearly had, and while I had my suspicions, I didn't ask questions. Some battles are better fought through silence. The article dropped 4 days later. "Vision or Exploitation: The Rise and Fall of a Timber Executive," read the headline. It was explosive. The journalist had done her homework, citing interviews with anonymous employees, pulling financial comparisons, and most notably, revealing that Trevor had a pattern of similar misconduct at his former firm. Turns out, Northwest was not the first company he'd tried to modernize by gutting experienced teams and funneling contracts to personal connections. It was just the first company where someone had stopped him before the damage became irreversible. The article went viral in the industry. Executives shared it on LinkedIn. Clients called Northwest asking for clarification. 2 of the companies named in the Sweetheart deals saw immediate reputational damage. One lost a state-level forestry partnership. The other had its government contract flagged for review. And Trevor, gone, blacklisted. He issued a single statement through a lawyer denying all wrongdoing, but it barely registered. His name, once associated with innovation, was now synonymous with ethical failure. Greg quietly vanished. No new job postings, no LinkedIn updates. Rumor had it he moved back to California to take a break. And me? I'd just signed a contract to become director of operations at a sustainable building materials firm, expanding into engineered timber. They had followed the entire Northwest situation closely and reached out after the article, impressed not just by my operational track record, but by my integrity. "We don't just want someone who knows systems," the CEO told me. "We want someone who can lead through storms." It was the validation I didn't know I needed. Even better? Over the following months, 5 of my former team members joined me at the new company. Engineers, analysts, and project managers I had trained, mentored, and trusted. We were building something new, rooted in the same values Trevor had tried to erase: transparency, accountability, and long-term vision. As for Northwest, they stabilized. The board became more involved, instituted new oversight processes, and recommitted to sustainable practices. I continued consulting with them periodically, quietly, behind the scenes, not for recognition, but because I still cared about the company I helped shape. Looking back now, I realize the story wasn't just about revenge or redemption. It was about what happens when someone tries to erase your legacy, and you choose to defend it not with rage, but with clarity, precision, and truth. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say isn't loud or dramatic. It's showing the world what you're capable of after the door closes, and letting your actions speak louder than any severance package ever could.